In May of 2005, Jennings, Louisiana was changed forever when the first of what would become 8 very infamous murder victims was discovered floating in a canal. Over the next 4 years, 7 more victims would be discovered in and around the city. The murders remain unsolved to this day and have haunted Louisiana for over 15 years. What's worse is the fact that residents of Jennings feel that there has been so much documented police misconduct that there could also be responsibility for these deaths among those who are supposed to be entrusted to seek justice. Deep-rooted and strong belief in these suspicions largely divides the community to this day. Although arrests have been made in the past, a lack of evidence has always resulted in the charges being dropped. The families are fed up, the town is on edge, and finding the answers to what truly happened to these women seems like a pipe dream. This is the story of the Jennings 8. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime cases each week. Last week was part 4 of my Louisiana serial killer series, which happens to be the series that I'm wrapping up today. So if you're interested in that video or any other video within the series, I will make sure to have the entire playlist linked up here in the card for you. And if you're just interested in true crime in general like me and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Jennings, Louisiana is a small town where everybody knows everybody. With a population of about 10,000 people, Jennings is located in the southwestern corner of Louisiana and is referred to by the locals as God's country. For a long time, Jennings was known for its super intense heat and humidity, incredible Cajun cuisine, music, and museums. However, on May 20th, 2005, that sweet, wholesome reputation was flipped completely upside down when the partially nude body of 28-year-old wife and mother of 2, Loretta Lewis, was discovered by a fisherman floating along the Grand Marais Canal, just 5 miles south of Jennings. Due to the body's advanced state of decomposition, making an initial identification was extremely difficult, as was pinpointing a cause of death. When Loretta was autopsied, her toxicology report determined that she had extremely high levels of cocaine and alcohol in her system at the time of her death. Now, I would love more than anything to be able to leave information about substance abuse and drug addiction out of this story. I try to anytime I can in order to remain respectful to the victims as well as their families. However, that topic in particular is almost the foundation of this story. Not to mention that the families have been extremely open about it in interviews and documentaries. Therefore, I don't realistically see a way to cover this case without mentioning it. That being said, at first, people did suspect that Loretta's death was a drug overdose. But as word got out and people learned the exact location that her body was discovered, they started to second guess that. They believed that it really wasn't a location that someone would naturally end up after a drug overdose. Rather, a location that someone would have to be thrown or dumped. Skepticism surrounding the drug overdose theory grew exponentially 1 month later when another body was discovered. The next victim, 30-year-old wife and mother of 5, Ernestine Patterson, had been missing for 2 days before her body was discovered in Acquiard Bayou on June 17, 2005. She had been dumped just 5 miles south of where Loretta Lewis's body had been discovered. What was different about Ernestine's body was that her throat had been cut and she was covered in defensive wounds. So even though she too was determined to have high levels of drugs and alcohol in her system at the time of her death, this was no overdose. It was a homicide. After Ernestine's body was discovered, the Jennings Police Department felt extremely overwhelmed. This kind of thing just didn't happen in Jennings. Murders were typically few and far between. They decided to consult with outside agencies in order to determine if there was any connection between these 2 deaths. Sheriff Ricky Edwards was sure that if they could determine a connection between the 2 victims, they could solve the case. But 2 months after Ernestine's body was discovered, Hurricane Katrina tore through Louisiana, and this took an enormous toll on law enforcement. Much like we saw in the case of Ronald Dominique, investigations were put on hold because law enforcement quickly became consumed with the immediate task at hand. So they felt extremely lucky when 3 months later, witnesses came forward with information that police hoped might solve the Ernestine Patterson case. In December 2005, Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon were implicated by witnesses who alleged that they had seen the pair partying with Ernestine shortly before her death, and that they were later seen covered in blood, transporting a large, very full trash bag. Because of this information, they were indicted in early 2006, but the case fell apart almost as quickly as it came together. together. Forensic testing of Lawrence Nixon's vehicle failed to yield any evidence that could tie him to the murder. And on top of that, the key witness that had initially come forward later recanted their statement. So the district attorney had no choice but to drop the charges against Jones and Nixon, who were then released. After that, the murders seemed to stop. Residents of Jennings attempted to settle back into their normal lives, and for almost 2 years, things seemed to calm down. Until March 18th, 2007, when the body of 21-year-old Kristen Lopez was discovered face down in the Petitjean Canal by a fisherman. Kristen had last been seen on March 6, 2007, before she was reported missing 9 days later. Her body was almost completely nude when she was discovered, and she had been partially consumed by alligators. That, coupled with her advanced state of decomposition, meant that determining an exact cause of death was unlikely. Medical examiners assumed that she had died of asphyxiation, and although they were unable to prove so one way or another, her death was still treated as a homicide. Like the other victims, Kristen's toxicology report came back with high levels of drugs and alcohol in her system at the time of her death. This is where things kind of start to get complex as the girls' personal lives begin to get intertwined. At the time of her death, Kristen Lopez was dating Loretta Lewis's cousin, Tracy Chasson. The similarities between these women's deaths, the ways they were found, and their social circles seemed to bring residents of Jennings to the conclusion that these women's deaths were definitely connected in some way. They believed that these girls specifically had been targeted, and this really started to spark paranoia throughout the community. Little did they know, the nightmare was far from over. The next victim was discovered less than 2 months later. 26-year-old Whitnei Dubois had last been seen on May 10th, 2007 at the home of a man named Frankie Richard. Sidebar, lock in that name because you will be hearing it again. After leaving her grandmother's house that evening, it's reported that Whitnei then made her way to Frankie's house. And no one knows what happened between her arriving at Frankie's house and her body being discovered. Nevertheless, her nude body was found on May 12th, 2007. She was lying in the middle of a gravel road near the intersection of Bobby and Earl Duhan, located about 3 miles outside of Jennings. She was the first victim that had been disposed of on dry land in such an obvious way. But because Whitnei had not been reported missing between May 10th and May 12th, there were no open missing persons cases to help police identify her. Therefore, she had to be identified through fingerprint analysis during her autopsy. And I'm going to start to sound like a broken record, but these are the facts of the case. We're talking about a body found in the middle of spring in a city that is known for its heat and humidity, so Whitnei was also in an incredibly advanced state of decomposition. Therefore, much like with Kristen Lopez, the medical examiner could only hypothesize that Whitney's cause of death had been asphyxiation, but he had to officially report it as undetermined. Her toxicology report also yielded results that showed she had high levels of drugs and alcohol in her system at the time of her death. After Whitney's death, the public really started to put pressure on law enforcement to solve these cases. Whitney's family in particular has been extremely vocal about their dissatisfaction with the way that law enforcement has handled these cases. And rightfully so. But the small police force in Jennings was grossly under-equipped to handle this situation. Like I'd mentioned, murder had only ever been a once-in-a-while occurrence in Jennings up to this point. They had never had this many people killed in this short of a span of time. Some hope was restored when, just days after Whitney's body was discovered, police actually made another arrest. This time in relation to the murder of Kristen Lopez. Once again, police thought they had caught a lucky break when Loretta Lewis's cousin / Kristen Lopez's girlfriend, Tracy Chasson, implicated local strip club owner, drug dealer, and drug addict Frankie Richard. Frankie was rumored to have been the last person to see Loretta, Kristen, and Whitney alive. Not to mention that he had admittedly had sex with most, if not all, of the girls. But Frankie wasn't the only person implicated by Tracy Chasson's statement. Frankie's niece, Hannah Connor, was also arrested in relation to Kristen Lopez's death. And both she and Frankie were also questioned about Loretta, Whitney, and Ernestine. Hannah has since alleged that while in custody, the police tried to coerce her into saying that Frankie had been responsible for the deaths of the girls and that he had forced her to help him clean it up. That in return for this confession, they would take her charge down to manslaughter and she could be out within 5 years. But Hannah refused to plead guilty to something that she maintains to this day she was never a part of. And I'll bet she's glad because Tracy Chasson ended up recanting her statement. She claimed that she had only implicated Frankie and Hannah because the Jennings police had been hounding her for information. So eventually she broke and just repeated some rumors that she had heard on the street. Without Tracy's statement, there was simply not enough evidence to hold Frankie or Hannah in relation to the murder of Kristen Lopez. evidence. Therefore, the case was dropped and they were eventually released, and Hannah maintains her innocence to this day. And Frankie maintained that he, quote, never hurt a hair on those girls' heads, unquote, until his death on March 22nd, 2020. No one else has ever been arrested in relation to the Jennings 8 murders, and unfortunately, we are only at the halfway point. From there, the next victim was 23-year-old Laconia, or Muggy Brown. Muggy's body was found almost exactly 1 year after Whitney's on May 29th, 2008. She was discovered around 3 a.m. by a police officer lying in the middle of East Racca Road. Now, what was notably different about Muggy's body was that while her throat had been slit just like Ernestine's had, her body had then been doused in bleach. I assume in an effort to destroy any potential forensic evidence. Another interesting fact about Muggy's body was that she had been discovered on a road that led to a shooting range that was used exclusively by law enforcement. We'll get into this extensively later, but there is a lot of mistrust between the residents of Jennings and the police department as far as this case is concerned. A lot of people believe that the police were somehow involved in these murders, and I'll tell you what, by the end of this video, you won't not think it's a possibility. The fact that Muggy's body was discovered by a police officer on a road frequented by police officers was not a coincidence that was lost on the residents of Jennings. From there, the next victim was 24-year-old wife and mother, Crystal, or Shay, Zeno. Shay was last seen on August 29th, 2008, before her body was discovered on September 11th by a group of hunters. She had been dumped on a levee in the woods near an irrigation canal just south of Jennings. Shay's body was in the absolute worst state of decomposition out of any of the victims when she was found. Because of this, it actually took 2 months to identify her body using DNA comparison. It also meant that determining a cause of death with 100% certainty was impossible. The coroner, yet again, had to make an assumption to the best of his ability that Shay had died from asphyxiation. However, her death was formally listed as undetermined. What's really fucked up is that before Shay went missing, she had expressed feelings of concern to her mother about these murders. Specifically, feelings that she might be next, and she won't be the only victim to do this. I've mentioned that these girls had a lot of connections to one another in their personal lives and seemed to run in similar social circles, and Shay was no exception. She knew both Kristen Lopez and Brittney Gary, who we'll get to shortly, and she obviously felt connected enough with the previous victims to believe that their deaths could mean that her life was also in jeopardy. I guess what I'm saying is bear in mind that these women seem to know each other and run in similar social circles, and that a lot of them felt that their lives were also in danger leading up to their deaths, which I think makes it extremely likely that these deaths are connected in some way. By this point, the families are pissed. They felt like law enforcement had not been doing enough to solve the cases, and because of this, women continued to turn up dead. They had lost so much faith in the police department that they took it upon themselves to hire private investigator Kirk Menard to help them solve the cases themselves. But they had barely retained his services for 48 hours before the next victim went missing. 17-year-old Brittney Gary was Kristen Lopez's cousin. She was good friends with Whitney, Muggy, and Shay, and Ernestine had actually worked with her mother, Teresa. So she had prior knowledge of or a prior relationship with most, if not all, of the other victims in this case. Brittney went missing on November 2nd, 2008, and was discovered off of Highway 1126 on Keystone Road, just 4 miles south of Roanoke. She was last seen on surveillance footage at the local Family Dollar around 5:30 p.m. Brittney was missing for 2 weeks before her mother got fed up with police and took it upon herself to form a search party to go out and find her daughter. They set out on horseback, on four-wheelers, and on foot to search Jeff Davis Parish to find Brittney. And it took them days, but sure enough, on November 15th, one of the members of the search party discovered Brittney's body. She was once again in a very advanced state of decomposition, making it difficult to recognize her, let alone determine an exact cause of death. Even though they hadn't yet confirmed her identity with DNA or fingerprints, the search for Brittney was called off because tattoos that were present on the body were consistent with tattoos that were fairly unique to Brittney. So they were sure pretty quick that they had found the young girl. Again, the coroner could not say for sure, but he assumed that she had likely died of asphyxiation. And like the others, her official cause of death was marked as undetermined. To recap, it's been 3.5 years, and there's been virtually no progress made in solving any of these murders, and women's bodies just keep turning up. The community had long since moved on from anger and frustration with the police department to total and complete outrage. In response to this, Sheriff Ricky Edwards held a press conference to reassure the public that he and his officers were very serious about solving these crimes and bringing the responsible party to justice. He announced that they were so serious, in fact, that a task force of 14 separate federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies had been formed strictly to solve these murders. But for the families who had been fighting for justice for their loved ones for years, it was too little too late. They felt that they had not been properly kept up to date with the investigation and that, frankly, the investigation hadn't moved forward at all. They felt as if they and the sheriff's office had actually been working against one another and not together. Even more infuriating was the fact that Sheriff Edwards would not say definitively whether or not he believed they were looking for a serial killer, or that the deaths could even be related in some way. Let's face it, the serial killer theory is totally possible. I mean, if we've learned anything over the last month, it's that serial killers are Louisiana's bread and butter. But the refusal to acknowledge the fact that the murders were likely related really pissed people in Jennings off. The fact that police were trying or hoping to chalk some of the murders up to potential overdoses had people's blood boiling. No one believed that multiple women had overdosed and ended up naked in these obscure locations. The idea of this was ludicrous to them. Even more ridiculous was that the police were totally willing to entertain the idea of a serial dumper rather than a serial killer. Serial dumper. As in someone who's coming across these women post-overdose and taking it upon themselves to discard of their bodies. Whitnei Dubois' sister can be quoted as saying that the idea of a serial dumper is one of the stupidest things she's ever heard, and I have to say I agree. Due to the fact that the only theories police had thrown out publicly were preposterous, citizens began to demand more action. Demand that police get their heads out of their asses, essentially, and that they figure out what was going on before another woman ended up dead. Unfortunately, they were not up to the task. 9 months later, on August 19th, 2009, the final victim, 26-year-old mother of four, Necole Guillory, was discovered off of Interstate 10 in Acadia Parish. She had been missing since August 16th, and just like the other women, she was too far along in the decomposition process to accurately determine her cause of death. Which is insane to me. 3 days and you can't pinpoint a cause of death? The heat in Jennings really must be a bitch. Without the ability to say for certain, the coroner once again went with reliable and assumed that her cause of death had been asphyxiation, but formally marked it as undetermined. Like some of the other victims, in the days leading up to her death, Necole had been living in constant fear. She wasn't just scared that she might be next, but it was almost as if she was certain that she would be. She went as far as to tell her mother not to bother making her a birthday cake because she likely wouldn't be around to celebrate. Not only that, but she had gone out of her way to place her children in the care of other family members in order to protect them from whoever or whatever she was so scared of. Who or what is, for the most part, still up for debate, but a friend of Nicole's named Henry Taylor has stated on the record that Necole told him, quote, "If anything happens to me, it was the police," unquote. This revelation likely came as a shock to no one in Jennings. It seemed as though the divide between citizens and police was just constantly going from bad to worse. There was absolutely no confidence left in the police or the task force. The families felt as though the investigation just was not being taken seriously. So much so that they began exclusively working with and relaying information to Kirk Menard. And I'll tell you what, this pissed the police off. It was just a constant back and forth, and honestly, it was a hot-ass mess. The police were now on the outs of their own investigation due to the lack of trust they had from residents. Whitnei Dubois' brother, Mike, said in an interview, I believe in 2018, quote, "I started asking questions of the police, and the more questions I asked and the more things that came up, the more I realized that something wasn't right with them," unquote. And eventually, the distrust and dissatisfaction turned into a full-on theory of corruption. People began to accuse the police of either direct involvement or, at the very least, helping to cover up for whoever was responsible. And honestly, I don't think these accusations are outlandish, because some of Jennings' good old boys were caught red-fucking-handed being shady as hell. In 2007, Jeff Davis deputy Warren Gary was found guilty of an ethics violation and fined $10,000 after he bought a truck from a potential witness. He then turned around, cleaned it up, and resold it for a hefty profit. Allegedly, this truck had been used to transport and dispose of the body of Kristen Lopez at the request of Frankie Richard. But that really didn't matter to law enforcement because this man, Warren Gary, and shit gets wild here, Mr. Ethics Violation himself, got promoted to run the evidence room. I'm sorry, what? Tell me that is not the biggest steaming pile of bullshit you've ever come across. This man that was found guilty of and fined for potentially tampering with evidence was now put in charge of the place where they kept all the evidence for everything. Wow. As if that wasn't bad enough, Mr. Gary wasn't the only issue within the sheriff's office or the task force. There was also Miss Paula Guillory, no relation to Jeffrey Lee. No, Paula was a Jeff Davis deputy and task force member that ended up getting fired for mishandling money and evidence. And then there's Police Chief Johnny Lasseter, who got busted stealing pills, money, cocaine, and marijuana from the Jennings evidence room. This indiscretion damaged a lot of the department's open cases. He did eventually get caught. He pled guilty and was required to pay back the money he stole, as well as serve a 5-year prison sentence. But let's be real, that doesn't even put a dent in repairing everything that he managed to fuck up. I don't know what is going on down there, but evidence handling seems to be a real big issue. Now, police weren't naive. They knew that they had completely lost the trust of their community. So in 2009, the sheriff made everyone who had worked or was currently working on the case submit a DNA sample. The hope was that this would put to rest the community's accusations of potential police involvement. Sounds like a promising thing, right? Wrong. The results were never publicly released or even commented on. Suspicious. What started off as a way to regain the community's trust just turned out to be another nail in their coffin, so to speak. With all that being said, is there anyone out there who cannot understand why the people of Jennings don't trust the police? Please, show of hands. Yeah, I didn't think so. Other than the law enforcement theory, I think the second most widely believed possibility is that Frankie Richard was in some way or another involved. Some people have even merged the two theories and believe that police have been covering up for Frankie all these years. People in Jennings were intimidated by Frankie and scared of what he might be capable of. He's been referred to as the big bad wolf of Jennings. The major problem with this theory is that Frankie's dead now. So whatever he did know, he took to the grave. Therefore, unless he confided in someone before his passing or someone else was involved with him in some way, we will never know the truth, which would be heartbreaking for the families. Beyond that, there are a few theories that I do feel like are worth mentioning. One being that the police were using all of the victims as confidential informants to gather information on the drug trade, and that they may have been killed as a result of this. Another is that a congressman who owned a hotel called the Boudreaux Inn was basically running a brothel for police and other important, powerful individuals to frequent, and that the Jennings 8 women used the hotel to conduct business, and that they were killed because of information they knew from the time they'd spent there. Another interesting thing that I came across, and I obviously have to mention, is that Jeffrey Lee Guillory was actually looked at early on as a possible suspect because his wife, Bridget, was originally from Jennings. So police thought maybe that connected him to the city in some way. However, nothing could be used to conclusively tie him to the first 4 murders, and he was arrested for the last time in January of 2008. Therefore, he could not be responsible for the deaths of Muggy, Shay, Brittney, or Necole. I don't actually think he was involved at all. I just thought it was interesting, and you know how I get a kick out of all the different ways that these cases have overlapped. The last theory that I'll cover again surrounds the Jennings police. It takes us back to April 20th, 2005, exactly 1 month before Loretta Lewis's body was discovered. A man named Leonard Crochet was shot and killed by a police officer during a supposed drug bust, despite the fact that he was unarmed. No shockers so far. Subsequently, the investigation into the shooting determined that the officer who'd shot Leonard had done so justly. Still not shocked. That being said, it's since been rumored that the Jennings 8 victims were present when Leonard was murdered, let's call it what it is, and that because they were there, they were targeted in order to conceal either what they knew about the drug bust or the shooting or both. Again, this is just a theory, as are all of the possible scenarios I've outlined. Nothing has ever been proven one way or another regarding the involvement of any law enforcement agency or any individual in the deaths of the Jennings 8. And unfortunately, That's pretty much where our story ends. Police say that they're still actively investigating the murders, and there is still an $85,000 reward for any information that leads to the cases being solved. Regardless, these women's families are still grieving their loved ones with absolutely no closure. Not to mention that there may still be someone out there who knows exactly what happened to these women and has just been keeping it to themselves all these years. It's really devastating that there has been basically no progress, or at least publicized progress, on this case for 16 years. And short of a deathbed confession, it really doesn't seem like we're ever going to get answers. I'm incredibly sad for these women and incredibly sad for their families. The apparent lack of urgency displayed by law enforcement in these cases is so frustrating. As far as my personal opinion on what happened, I don't know. I definitely think that the deaths are all related, and I do think that these specific girls were targeted for some reason. But that being said, I have no fucking idea who could possibly be responsible. I think there is so much information and so many theories that trying to make an educated guess is almost impossible. But I do think Frankie Richard knew a little something. I don't know if he was responsible, but I think he knew some stuff. And with that, next week, we are moving the hell out of Louisiana. There's confetti in my hair. This series has been fun and super interesting, but I am so ready to explore some new horizons. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out new true crime content each week, and I would love to see you back here in my next video, which will not be taking place in Louisiana. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.